fished as a kid, like from 6 years old up upstate. My aunts had places up in the Catskills, and I was doing a lot of fishing up there. And you're talking of like pin hooks with little dough balls, fishing in a 5-foot stream and catching little bait fish. And I'd go out in the morning at the first thing in the morning, and they say, come on in for breakfast. And I'd go out at lunchtime, and they'd say, come on in for lunch, because I kept going out fishing all day long. So it was, I guess it was in my blood. I just enjoyed spending the time catching fish. It progressed because I started making plugs and I started catching fish. And guys would say, you should go and start selling plugs on the beach to guys. And I never really did that. But what happened was in 1960, I was fishing underneath the Atlantic Beach Bridge, and I met two of Dan's buddies, Joe and Al. In 1966, when I moved into the house, Dan said he just ordered a lathe from Sears, and he says, let's start, he says, now that you're in a house, order a lathe and we'll start making plugs together. And we never did any of this until 1966. And Campo turned around, he used it over near Sag Harbor, and he come back and he told me, he was the first one to try it out, actually fishing out east. And he got some off me, and he says to me, Don, he says, don't change the thing on that dart, he says, because it just kills fish. Angelo and I can't remember the other guy, they used to go up to the Cape, and they asked me, hey Don, could you make a jointed darter? And I did. I turned around and come out with a jointed darter. And then they said, could you make a jointed bottle plug? And I did that. Well, that there went over, but I didn't make a lot. It was just way too much work. And I think I was only charging like $6 for that plug back then, which was ridiculous. The difference in wood and plastics is it's uniform. Everything else is down to about 1/1000th of an inch. Everything is exact. It doesn't draw water. When you make a wooden plug, you're always going to get a certain amount of water in it, no matter what. And you never know where the poorest part of the plug is going to be. It can be in the top, it can be in the bottom, it can be in the sides. If it's in the bottom, it's not bad. But it's like what happens to your doors in August. Just from humidity, they start sticking, the drawers start sticking. Now you're putting the plugs in the water. Weigh your plug before you start using it, and then weigh it a couple hours after and see the difference. One of the guys just recently did an article on the metal lip, and he said, I know there was a thing that who designed it and everything else, and he says, well, if Don really designed it, why didn't he turn around and talk to Dan and have it out with Dan, and why didn't his name go on it? Because Dan turned around and said to me, you're going to screw up the deal if you go to Lupo, and I'm going to give you half what I'm getting, and I let that go by. Okay? Yeah, well, Steve Campo, when we were fishing in Block Island, being that they would go up there for 6 weeks at a time, he would give me a lot of feedback on colors, or what colors were taking fish and what was going on. I mean, it was all the needlefish. There was times it was the white, it was the dark green, it was the neon green that seemed to be the hottest. Then we come out with the 2-hook plug. In fact, I come out with the 2-hook plug right after my first trip up to the Cape, because when you got into a blitz of fish, you were going crazy on hooking three hooks, and I said, I'm not going to make any more plugs with 3 hooks. I got to get rid of that. I got to go into 2 hooks. I said, Bomber had that 6-inch, not the 6-inch, the 7-inch Bomber. I said, that only has 2 hooks. It catches fish. I says, I can make all the plugs with 2 hooks rather than 3 hooks. And it, you know, when guys get fish, it's a lot easier to unhook them. I come out with the bottle plug, the 3-ounce bottle plug, and Charlie Ruger, Pete Furman, all right, and there was a guy, Bill Michelson. They were fishing Joneses all out there, and they did a job on it in Joneses on this 3-ounce bottle plug. And they were some guys were using Gibbs, but Gibbs wasn't producing as much as this, because this went deeper. Gibbs plug didn't go, their 3-ounce bottle didn't go as deep as mine. And what happened was, I made this. I come back from Montauk and I called up Ted's Tackle Shop. He had the Whitewater Club, used to meet on a Tuesday. I called Ted up and I told him, I'm making this plug, would you like to handle some? And he said to me, all right, yeah. He said to me, it was, I think, 5 dozen. He says, give me 5 dozen of these plugs. I said, all right, when I get them done, I'll give them to you. I get a call from Dan a couple days later. I think, in fact, I'm almost positive it was a Tuesday night. Dan go to the meeting. Ted turns around and tells him about the Whitewater Club. Okay, in other words, tells him at the Whitewater Club that I'm making his plug. Dan calls me up a couple days later and he says to me, when you get the plugs made, he says, I was working over in a job off Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. He says, I'll meet you. You know, there's the gas station on Grand Central Parkway that's closed down, that stone one in between. He says, I'll meet you over there, and I'll take the plugs to Ted, and I'll save you the trip. I get the plugs done. I bring them over, give them to Dan. Dan takes them to Ted. I don't know how long later. He turns around and he brings me some money, and he says to me, Ted only had the money for 2 dozen plugs. And he gives me money for 2 dozen plugs. I'm going to go out to Montauk in August or early September, and I go into Ted because I broke the tip of the rod, and I wanted a guide to be put on, and I go over there, and Ted has a face as soon as he sees me, and he's walking away from me, and I knew something was wrong because Ted was a real gentleman, and I said, what's going on, Ted? And he says to me, well, you promised me plugs and I never got them. I said, what are you talking about? I says, you got the plugs. I says, because Dan gave me money for 2 dozen plugs. He says, you never gave me the plugs. I never got your plugs. And as he's walking, you ever go into Ted's tackle? No, you never were. He had, like you go into a bar, he had a counter with all plugs and reels and that, and then he had like a back counter where you'd keep the liquor on the shelves. It was all glass and enclosed. And as he walked away, I followed him. And I got halfway back in the store, and I'm looking at the counter. There it is. There's all my plugs, the bottle plugs, sitting there. And I said to him, Ted, there's my plugs. He says, what are you talking about? He says, Dan brought him in and told me his son made them. I don't think his son ever made a plug in his life, Danny, or James. And he says, there's the plugs Dan made. You know, Dan's son made. I says, no, they're the plugs that I made. There's my plugs. I said, if you want, I'll turn around and send you one. You can compare them. And that was the end. When I got that news, that was the end. I never bothered to talk to Dan or see Dan after.